Good morning. My name is Sarah Gary and I am Chief Executive of the Property Care Association. Welcome to today's session, Flooding and the Built Environment, How Can We Protect Homes and Residents? For those of you who don't know the PCA, we are the leading representative organisation for the UK's building protection industry. Our skilled and audited membership operate across domestic, commercial and civil sectors in the structural repair, structural waterproofing, wood preservation, damp protection, ventilation, flood remediation and invasive weed control industries. Before we head into this morning's session, just a few notes on housekeeping. Your microphones have all been muted as there are lots of you on the line today. However, if you would like to ask a question, please post this in the chat. We will be taking questions for our panel, so please do also add these into the chat as we go through the meeting. Depending on the question, we might not be able to give you specific advice, so please keep your questions general and related to today's webinar. And if you've got any technical problems, again, please post these in the chat and my colleague Natalie will be able to support you. I'd now like to welcome the speakers to our panel discussion today. We're lucky enough to be joined by three experts, Kerry Halfpenny, an experienced damp and flood surveyor who works with homeowners in some of the worst affected flood regions of the UK. We're also joined by John Mattinson, a fellow of the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management, who's a flood risk expert and also works as an expert witness. And we're also joined by Andrew Devitt, our technical manager here at the PCA, who started his career as a structural engineer and has become an expert in structural waterproofing and flood resilience. In a slightly different approach to our normal webinars, I'm going to ask each of our three panellists to spend 5 minutes setting out their experience and based on that, what they think we should be doing to protect homes and residents from flooding. So with that, Kerry, I'd like you to start us off, please.
Right. Last year, I finished a master's degree in building surveying and did a dissertation and a piece of research on the risk to life living in basement flats due to surface water flooding in London. I interviewed 9 people, some from I had the highest people I could get in terms of technical ability. So I used people in the industry itself. We had DEFRA, we had people from DEFRA, we had people from the British Standards, people from the PCA, Syria, the Environment Agency, and a couple of people from businesses that work in the sector. All the findings were that there was a significant risk to life living in basement flats in London. From that, means of escape was a massive issue. I looked at research in Germany when 182 people died. People were sent the wrong way. People were sent into basements. From that, we looked at what we wanted to do and get what the recommendations were. Wanted a joint position statement from the PCA, Syria, CIWEM, the British Standards, RICS and planning, a review of the standards and code of practice on the risk to life living in basement flats. Maybe we should be looking at building control and legislation, the installation of flood doors, should they be done? There's 5,462 basement flats all in a flood zone risk 3 in London alone. They've estimated that there's going to be 40 deaths when London floods. What they didn't say with the 40 deaths on the London Strategic Interim Report was that 40 deaths, if the Thames is bridged, goes over 200. So we've got a massive issue in London alone, and we need to be looking at it. In terms of means of escape, how are we going to get people out? What are we installing? And then we need to be looking at subterranean car parks. What are we going to start putting signs up to say you're not going to be allowed in here if there's going to be a massive flood or there's a huge deluge of rain and we're now on a flood warning? You're not going to be able to retrieve your car, because there was many that died in Spain when they went into the car parks to retrieve the cars. So I think I've set my scene there. Bit nervous, sorry about that.
You're muted, Sarah.
Apologies. Thank you, Kerry. That gave us a really good overview of that, the risk to life, and particularly in existing structures where we already have the buildings built and we're digging down into basements, and potentially there's going to be some flood impact on those residents. That was really helpful. Thank you. So I'd now like to hand over to Andrew. And Andrew, I think you're going to talk to us a bit about flood performance certificates and the environment that exists currently.
Yeah, I just set the scene first, Sarah. So who am I? Yeah. Well, I started my career as a naval engineer. So I'm experienced with water, both from under my feet and from above the ground. So and then I started to work in hydraulics, and I worked underground with doing hydraulic systems and pumping systems for the National Coal Board. So I'm familiar with water, both above the ground and underground. But later in my career, I changed to be a structural engineer, as Sarah mentioned. But I've developed more in that particular area to building engineering, specifics to building, and more so recently to building pathology, understanding how a building performs in certain conditions. The last 10 years, I've been, before I come here at the PCA, I worked in the insurance industry. And so I've seen the effects which, or impacts of various incidents can have on buildings and how we can restore them through the insurance industry. So I'm pretty much aware of those sort of things. And then for the past year, I've been at the PCA, specifically looking at structural waterproofing, but my time has now shifted slightly towards the flood sector and supporting our members in guidance on how to make properties more flood resilient. So that's more of my role. So as Sarah has mentioned, that the Property Care Association is the UK's leading organisation for structural repair, structural waterproof, and in this particular case for flood remediation as well. So that's our specific role. So the PCA and my role is more focused on the complete building envelope. So all our members are made up of contractors, independent professionals, designers, and manufacturers, and their expertise helps them protect the integrity, but also the comfort of buildings and homes, especially when those are flooded. So that's both in the new build and in the refurbishment projects that we have. So what we're trying to do is guard against problems such as moisture and water damage, damp, mold, and decay. So really, I'm looking at how we can protect our buildings, and that's the emphasis that we have. So as I said, my role now is more towards the current flooding sector. And we know that environmental changes are here to stay. We're not going to do anything. We can't do anything about them. That's a bigger picture on the world scene. But environmental issues are here to stay. But how can we better protect our homes? How can we mitigate the risks from environmental, geographical, and urbanization changes? And what can we do to understand and evaluate all of these risks? How can we mitigate? That's an important aspect against these changes and make our homes more resilient to a flood event. And if we can make our homes more resilient, then that will reduce recovery times and people can return to their homes after a flood event. There are lots of other issues, which was, and Kerry's mentioned it, is how we can protect the occupants of flooded properties, and that's so. it's a vast topic, but how can we bring all of these things together? And yeah, and the Flood Re has said that we want to try and put a flood performance certificate on on individual homes, to recognise how that property is flood resilient and make it more insurable from the insurer's aspect. How that's going to be done is a difficult scenario, but you know, I'm trying to work in that direction to try and bring all these factors together to make a flood performance certificate for a you know, for our home. That's it, basically. That's
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. That's wonderful. And now turning to John. John, I think you've got some case studies and some specifics to talk to us about. Oh, you're on mute, John.
Hello.
That's better. Thank you.
Goodness me. Yes, I was just saying, I'd like to thank Andrew for reminding me of a very important starting point, using the word mitigation. In the hierarchy of risk, we always try and eliminate risk, but water is very tenacious and elimination is almost impossible. I'm sure we'll all understand that. So mitigation is where we all sit. I've got a long experience in the public and private sector as client, contractor and consultant. So I've had an appreciation of all the roles. And within this process, whether it's highways, structures or water, which I've worked in all three, but majored in water, people are the most important element, no matter where they sit, whether it's the client, the designer, the constructor, the people who are affected by what's going on. And my first experience as a very, very young person, I was taken out onto site with a senior engineer to respond to a flood incident. Would you believe that? And there was a gentleman in his mid-80s who had a bungalow and he had all sorts of elements of sewage around his garden and in his living room and dining room. He was very careful about what he said, very welcoming, very, and I was told before I went in to keep my mouth shut and just use my eyes. When I came out and got in the engineer's car, and I was aghast, and I said, how can this be like this in this country in the late 1970s? And he just turned to me and he said, welcome to my world. That rapidly became my world and has been ever since. And I'm constantly working with colleagues to try and mitigate the risk of flooding to existing properties, whether it's business, commercial, domestic, wherever it is, we try and keep the water out. As I say, water is very tenacious. A lot of the people on the call probably realise we've gone from designing schemes to resist, to attenuate on a 10-year basis, 10-year return period basis. That has completely gone out the window over the last 40 or 50 years. We're tenfold over that. And it's in a response to the way the climate's changing, I admit that, but also the catchments are changing. There's far more impermeable area, which is creating some of the problems. We've got ancient infrastructure that we're trying to renovate, etc. And one of my particular key areas at the moment is how we actually deal with these problems in terms of the massive amount of problems with retrofit, large-scale modifications to infrastructure, buildings, property, very expensive, very difficult, takes a long, long time. So we're into now property flood resilience, build back better, very much more reactive, quick to get a solution, if you like. I don't like using the word solution, a treatment of a property, and it's also extremely proactive. However, there are certain things that we all share on this panel. fear, really, a respectful fear of water, and also the impact it's having and could have below ground. Kerry's alluded to this already, and we need to ensure a dynamic approach to how we respond to these events, and there's got to be better warning systems, etc. But I think we need dynamic approaches to codes of practice, regulations, standards, and the like, to make sure we all keep ahead of the game, or at least keep on track.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thanks to all our panellists for their introduction. I think that's given us a really good overview of the state of the nation so far. And we've had a reminder in the chat that obviously the basements in London, lots of people live in below ground, lower ground flats, converted flats, rather than just building new basements. So thank you for that reminder, Joan. In terms of our theme for today, it's flooding in the built environment. How can we protect homes and residents? And I think we've spoken about different types of homes, and we've spoken a lot about John, you've spoken about existing homes and preventing existing homes from flooding, but we've also got new builds being built as well. So can we take each of those in turn and perhaps discuss existing homes first? How do we prevent flooding and these catastrophic events from impacting those particular homes before we move on to new build, and whether there's any difference in what we need to do there? So, John, I don't know if you want to kick us off. What do you think we need to do in terms of existing properties?
In terms of existing properties, there's a myriad of things that can be done. As I say, there's a lot of use of PFR at the moment, which I've been involved in PFR for, 30 years, when we used to use wooden products to do the similar thing. They do enable a rapid response to emergent problems. So in recent times, people have said, when we've been out to interview them, you've got a problem with flooding. Yes. How long have you had the problem? Never before. Only started 6 months ago, and then for some reason there's been a change. So you can respond very quickly. There has to be a robust approach in terms of flood risk assessments, initial design, proposed construction, installation, continuing maintenance, but also it's training the people who are receiving these measures on the best way and to deploy them and to get the best out of them, how to look after them. It's very important. You can spend thousands on mitigating a property, leave people without the knowledge to maintain or where to go for this, and they're completely and utterly useless. So the measures are there. There's some great work going on nationally and internationally. We're the leaders in this country by a long stretch. DEFRA and the EA driving this with local lead flood authorities, the water companies, and a lot of individuals are picking this up. And there's so much that can be done. There's tried and tested measures. But as we were saying on our test event yesterday, it's not just plug and play. You've got to plug and play with intelligence and with a backup of analysis, flood risk surveys, modelling in some cases, and you can do wonders with it. But you've got to be careful that it's entirely appropriate. One, for the property in terms of retrofit. One watchword is you don't want to protect to, this sounds wrong, but you don't want to protect to a height that's infinite, because you'll get to a level where you start to experience structural problems, which Andrew will probably endorse, and ultimately collapse. The water's very powerful, so if you keep it out and do a good job, you really need an exceedance plan. That property needs to have exceedance. Nationally, at the moment, it's generally 600 millimetres above ground level without a structural survey. So we're actually not, I keep saying this, we're not eliminating the flood risk. We can't, because there'll always be an event, but it's reducing the exceedance opportunities and the damage and the distress and the upset. But it's PFR is very good, and also Build Back Better, which was championed by the insurance companies. That is a way to introduce mitigation, but also to improve the general fabric of the property to help it resist, in simple terms.
Thanks, John. And is that your experience, Kerry? Are you seeing people out in the field using Build Back Better?
Don't get me started on Build Back Better.
Go on.
Oh, we can't get it in Calderdale. It's a postcode lottery.
Wow.
I don't know anybody who's got Build Back Better in Calderdale. We're waiting for another flood. That's it. So Build Back Better doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned. Is it being tested? Are they just saying so many areas can have it? We flood every time. Why haven't we got it? We should be first on the list. It's ridiculous. And I agree with what you're saying there, John, about like PFR to 600 million height. Not everybody knows that. Not everybody knows, and we're going to the open market. It's like there's a flood bubble. The EA, DEFRA, Cywen, Syria in your flood bubble. What happens when this goes to open market? Because it will, without a shadow of a doubt. Somebody's going to get a flood door, B&Q, Eurocell, or another major player, and start selling them willy-nilly to anybody. What's going to happen then?
Well, let's
when anybody's installing them, they're ticking on a flood performance certificate that property's got a flood door. We don't know how it's installed, when it's installed, who installed it, what qualifications they've got, if any.
Yeah, but that's what we're talking about here. It's regulation, it's formalising things, even down to flood warnings.
John, there is no regulation. There's not even any regulation on means of escaping a basement flat, and you're talking about regulation.
Well, I'll pick that one up with you. If you've got a basement flat, right, I'll give you an example. I've done quite a bit of work on subterranean areas over the past 5 or 6 years. And one area was, interestingly, a car park. And we're 14 stories down, at the bottom of the car park. And I was asking the building manager what means of protection they had to prevent the water coming down the ramp and filling up the car park. And he said, oh, there's a sleeping policeman at the top. I said, oh, that's good. What height is it? I missed it when I came down, didn't measure it. Oh, it's about 4 inches high. Right. Once it gets over that, then what do we do? Oh, there's a pump in the cupboard over there. Right. Can we have a look at it? I haven't got the keys. Who's got the keys then? Ah, it's our building manager, the other one. Right. Okay. Can he come and let us in? Oh, he's on holiday for 2 weeks. Take the keys with him. So at that, I said to him, okay, I think we need to check the lift out and see if it works. But now, and he said, don't look at anything else. I said, no, it's unsafe to be down here. So basically, we've got a problem with, as Kerry's alluding to, the fact that the industry is very young. PFR is less. Most people think PFR has been around for 10 years. It's not. It's been around for a lot longer than that, mainly with the water companies. But 30 years is no life, and it's rapidly increasing. Floodry are doing a great job in terms of spreading the word. Lots of other people. We're doing it here. We're constantly doing it, and it's really about getting better control. But that's going to happen over time. There are measures out there and means to control work on site. As we all know, we've got a piece of legislation called, it's law, Construction Design and Management Regulations. And the severity of the punishments are very significant. And it's about time we, or the authorities, started to dust off the regulations and go and have a look at some of this work that's going on now. Not just PFR, around the country. Major construction sites, they're there needs to be more vigilance, but we're coming down to money and budget. Thing. Not good enough.
No, just following on from that, John, we've also got the Building Safety Act, which has come out as well last year, and which is really about that risk to life. I know that started with the Grenfell Towers fire. That's where it started. But I think it now extends to all buildings, regardless. So,
Sarah, we look at the Building Safety Act, right? In this country, we had Bradford City Football Club disaster.
Yeah.
55 people died, right? Then we had Hillsborough, 97 people died. Then we have Grenfell, 70-odd people died. Did we know them disasters was going to happen? No. Yet we know there's been estimated 40 deaths due to surface water flooding in London, and we can't get our regulations. I mean, only in November, the Code of Practice C790, after 8 years, was reviewed, and they've said there's going to be no amendments for the installation of PFR. How can that be right? When we've got over 5,000 basements in flood zone risk 3 in one London borough alone, and there's 33 of them protected by the Thames.
You're so passionate about this, Kerry, which is just wonderful to hear. I'm just going to move us on to one of the questions we've had in the chat about flood resilience certificates. Andrew, I'm just going to come back to you on that, because I know that's something you were talking about in your starting piece. But when we're thinking about existing properties, how will flood resilience certificates help, do you think? And do you think there's a time scale that we're looking at for those to be implemented? Oh, you're on mute, Andrew. We're all being so polite and putting ourselves on mute before we speak.
Yeah. So just taking one step back then, at the current situation, there are tens of thousands of houses which are uninsurable at this present time. And Flood Re have been established in 2016 to be able to support the insurance by reinsurance. So many properties now will come into that part of being able to be covered by flood. But this is just a limited program set up by the government until 2039. But it's still on the onus of property owners to make their homes flood resilient in any situation. So what Kerry was saying, Build Back Better, who was talking about that, but any homes built after 2009 are not eligible for Build Back Better schemes and what have you. So it's only those pre-2009. So it's a very limited sort of scheme in terms of the insurance industry. Flood Re have said, or trying to introduce a flood performance certificate to see how resilient a particular homes, to be able to make their homes, people's homes and commercial properties insurable at the end of the day. That's the aim, because it's costly to try and build a home which is resilient. And the limited funds which they have at the moment is only £10,000, I believe, at this present time, which is a small amount of money, because most homes which are flooded will be coming into the 30, 40, 50,000 pounds to restore a home. So this Build Back Better payment will help, but it's not the best. But what we need to look at is really how we can understand the risk. There are millions of homes built in flood risk zones 1, 2, and 3. But what is the risk of that home being flooded? Our environment is changing. It's constantly changing. So we've got to understand more about the flood risk factors. And in that way, we can start then to build up a picture of how to put a performance certificate, and how that individual building can actually resist or become resilient to water. As we know, if flood levels are increased above 600, there's more risk for structural damage. So therefore, we've got to allow the water to come into our homes. But how do we make it resilient so that after the flood event, the recovery time is significantly less? So it's trying to understand all these factors. So one is what is the risk? Where does the risk come from? Is it from the sky, from intense rainfall? Is it from the geographical location where we're in? It could be on the side of a hill, so therefore the risk becomes higher because the flow rates of flood water is significantly higher, can cause a lot more damage. And also we've got in lower regions, we've got groundwater where water comes up from the ground, from below the ground. So where's the source? So we've got to understand there. So these are the risk elements which we've got to try and understand what is the risk factor. So it could be high, medium or low, depending on where the location is. And then understanding the building, how does the building perform in a flood event? And so it's understanding those risks. And once we got evaluated all of those things, then we can put a process in place where we can really put resilience into the building and allow the building perform in a flood event. So a lot of factors coming into there. So one suggestion has come out that we do it like an energy performance certificate, where we understand the risks of flooding, what they are, where do they come from. We know what the building performance would be at a certain point, depending on its style, its structure, and where it's located. Bring all those there and put all these factors into a certificate or a document which can say, oh, this house will have a certain amount of resilience and protection. So, and in that way, the insurance industry can then understand the risks involved if they need to restore the building, but also it puts an onus on the building owner and how to make their homes more flood resilient. So there are a lot of things bringing together to try and put this flood performance certificate together. We've got 6.5 million homes at the current time which are at risk of flooding. What timescales have we got to be able to do these sort of putting this certificate together? Could it be 4 or 5 years to be able to do that? It could be longer to do all these sort of things. So yeah, there are a lot of factors there, but I think it's the way to go to understand how a home can be protected.
Thanks, Andrew. And we've got some comments in the chat which I think reflects Kerry's experience as well, that not everywhere is covered, not every type of property is covered by the flood re. So we've got a comment here about buildings that have more than 3 flats are excluded from the flood re scheme. And based on what you were saying earlier, Kerry, about the number of basement flats or lower ground floor flats that are going to be flooded, I imagine some of those flats will not be included under flood re and won't be able to access things like the Build Back Better scheme. So it sounds like there's perhaps a piece of work for us to do to engage with flood re and try and stop that gap, fill that gap. Can I move us on to maybe chat about new builds now? We've spent a bit of time talking about existing properties and what might be coming in for them. We have the same problems with new build properties. We are building in places perhaps we haven't built before, places that might be in current flood or future flood areas or subject to surface water flooding. But the government has an ambition to build 1.5 million homes over the next couple of years. So, that's a whole other conversation in itself. But based on that desire to build more and to build on new areas, what can we do for new build properties to prevent flooding? John, do you want to kick us off?
Well, new builds, there are techniques nationally and internationally. Generally, we try not to build in flood zones, but people do. And certainly in the Lincolnshire area, I know of a particular flood risk consultant who's a friend of mine, and he's constantly looking at ways for developers so that they can actually build, maybe instead of 2-story properties, 3 stories, where the ground floor is a wet room, storage area, sacrificial area, and where people have got disabilities, they come with a lift. So a big thing that we do in our society, we don't innovate enough. We don't think around, we don't see around corners, and that's what we have to do sometimes, instead of thinking in straight lines. So there are very simple things. The Dutch, strangely enough, have done an awful lot of things like this, and they've even got floating buildings that have got piles on each corner of the building. The water comes along, the building lifts. When the water subsides, it goes back down again. With all the utilities on flexible connectors, that works. There's all sorts of things you could do, but obviously the first thing in the risk hierarchy is to avoid it in the first place. So, and also we can, say, what can we do for new build? Well, let's look at risk again. There are certain buildings at the moment that can be repurposed, public buildings, shopping centres. You could have apartments. There's a shopping centre near me, which was thriving 20 years ago, but it's terrible now. So why not repurpose that, use the existing infrastructure, don't rebuild, make that safe. Let's start thinking a bit more creatively.
Yeah. Are you seeing anything locally, Kerry, in your area in terms of new builds and how they're preventing flooding?
Well, they are doing some new builds at the moment, and part of the planning application was that it didn't flood in the area. Yet there's proof that it flooded 3 feet deep and the culvert burst behind it, yet it's been ignored. And then all it's going to do is add more flooding to the area, yet they'll be all right because the ground floor is, like what John says, a wet room. But it will just create more flooding in a wider part of town and affecting more houses. So it's difficult. Building on floodplains, and people are saying that you can't do it, but where else are they going to build? They're going to do it.
Yeah,
they're doing it. We know they're doing it. So the ground floor, for me, it can't be living or part of the residential bit. It will only be wet rooms or a garage. But then I think what's happening is that companies are saying, well, let's mitigate the build. We'll put flood doors on and we'll go down that route, and then we'll get planning. And planning will be passed because we've mitigated against the flood in the property.
Yeah.
Yet that property won't ever be able to get flood insurance. And we're setting people up to fail.
Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, it comes down to the planning. As you said, Sarah, the 1.5 million homes to be built in the next 4 years of this government. Where they're going to build them, most likely you're going to be built on floodplain. But it's the planning process which needs to be carefully looked at as well, because each one of those, the flood risk assessment which they have in the planning process is very wishy-washy throughout the whole of the UK, and each one has their individual, flood risk assessments. But it's very poor. What I've seen is very poorly done. It needs to be more detailed in a flood risk assessment, which will then go on to how to mitigate any of those risks. Also, the introduction of SUDs and how we can use the urban, the geographical location to be able to control water in flood situations. So that needs to be put into the process of the planning application, and there needs to be greater investment within the existing infrastructure, because our drainage systems are very poor, and we need more development in that area. These are the sort of things which need to be looked in the planning process for building of new homes in certain areas, especially when it comes into known flood risk areas.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew, and to all of you. We have had quite a few points raised about homeowners or tenants' awareness of flooding risk. And I think you summed it up, Kerry, by, saying people are moving into these properties. As far as they're aware, they might move from one end of the country and not be aware that they flood.
I have a friend of mine who purchased a house locally, and she phoned me up. She said, every time it rains, Kerry, the kitchen floods, right? So I said, all right, I'll go round, and went round. I put a hole in the wall. Buried in the wall was a sump and a pump, right? She wasn't informed. The vendor didn't say that it had flooded. The house would have been worth £20,000 less. So she got in the estate agent. She sued the previous owner and won, and got that level of money back, so she could do the works to make it flood preventable, which has worked since, thank God. But it's got to be on some document somewhere. We've got to be informing people that these properties flood, or have flooded.
And if we have a flood performance certificate, if that was introduced, that would be transferable from one ownership, because it would be a valuable document for investors in property mortgage. So that would help. Yeah.
The flood performance certificate should be linked to an app, which then the app can tell you exactly what was installed on that house, and then that then can be informing you what to do when we flood. We know this is available now. That app, the Resilico app, that does it. So there's stuff out there that can make things really easy for people. It's knowledge and understanding. It's the flood. It's the flood bubble.
Yeah,
everybody knows about it. Construction don't know about flooding. It's the Building and Safety Act that will bring everybody together.
The big problem, Kerry, is we spend too much time talking about it. We know we've got systems in place. They need to be brought in. It's there.
Yeah.
Mark Arrowsmith's on the chat here. Resilico. It's there. It works.
Oh, there he is.
Let's embrace it. Let's get on with it. Because I've got here one of my notes here. My biggest concern is we need to ramp it up instead of, good to talk, but we need to start to move on quickly.
Yeah.
It takes too long. And that's where things like PFR have helped, because it's quick to implement. But because it's so quick, you've got to be careful to get the flood, as Andrew says, you've got to get the flood risk right and the design right and go. Spend that money, it's gone. You won't get it again. You get one chance, really.
It sounds like what you're all saying is we need some systemic change, that we've got these pockets of great innovation, but actually if everybody doesn't know about it, if homeowners aren't aware, if landlords aren't telling their tenants that properties have flooded because there's not a mandatory piece of paper they have to give them, then we still remain in the same situation, despite there being some really great pockets of innovation. Is that fair?
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So we've got lots and lots of comments in the chat. But before we get to some of that, can we just go back to infrastructure? We've had a few comments in the chat on infrastructure and the lack of infrastructure. You mentioned it in your starting piece, John, that even though there is infrastructure in place, such as sewer pipes and so on, that because it's aging, that's leading us to more problems. Can we just touch on that a little? John, do you want to start us off?
I think that the big enemy to this is, we talk about standards and codes of practice being dynamic instead of being written and then gathering dust on the bookshelf. This should be updated. Well, our thoughts on design have clearly changed. Like I said earlier, we're looking at 1 in 10-year return period for attenuation in the 90s. It's 10 times that in certain areas. We've got to move with the times, but it's how society and areas have developed in that. Sorry, somebody's trying to get me on another device here. Yeah, things like impermeable areas have gone through the roof. You know, more new development in inner cities. It's overcoming. With the area I live in, there was a massive scheme we built in the 90s for the water company, and it's a tunnel under the town. 10 years ago, it was 20 years after the scheme was commissioned. 10 years ago, 20 years later, it flooded again. It's after 20 years. So, but that design criteria now would be far more intense to reflect the return period in the impermeable areas. So, you know, we've got Victorian infrastructure in most cities, and we're trying to plug in modern life to that, and it doesn't work. So, you know, that's the big challenge to us. We're talking about PFR and this sort of thing, which is great, but if the infrastructure is not there to connect to, how much can you get? You know, we're storing sewage in the roads effectively by having barriers to prevent it going into buildings. So you've got a road acting as a sewer in certain areas. It's not right, but where's the money going to come from? Yes. Again, that's what we keep coming back to. Yeah, the money.
John, you mentioned that the Dutch. And of course, they're similar to us in the East Anglian region, where they have low-lying ground and what have you. And of course, they've also looked, and Germany have also looked at the rivers and how they're controlled. So, interestingly, from industrialisation back in the in the 19th century, rivers were actually straightened to try and bring more water into. And now they're trying to reverse that by, making the rivers slow down their rates and whatever, which also reduces flooding. So it could be geographical as well in terms of infrastructure and how we can better control the amount of volumes of water entering into our urban areas. So that's just one thought on that one as infrastructure controlling.
Well, I mean, the latest thing is obviously. The water companies have been tasked now to reduce the amount of spills from CSOs. Yeah. So what's the easiest way to do that? Get rid of them. So now what we're going to have is massive attenuation structures in cities and towns.
Yeah.
So you get a storm, you might have a series of storms it's designed for. What happens when you get something that's completely out of the box?
Yeah.
As we're seeing now.
There's no release there. They're just not going to dig up the whole infrastructure of the country, though, are they, John? They're not going to do it.
No.
You can't do it. And when Cumbria flooded in 2015, and that woman was stood in front of the Prime Minister, who was it at the time, and Bourne was the £5,000 grant, and it was Bourne. She shut everybody up. Yeah. So that we wouldn't start moaning about digging every road up and doing every sewer.
Oh. Hang on, though. That was in 2015.
And it's vatable.
Yeah. How much was the grant?
Have you ever heard anything like it in your life? Oh, yeah, it's £5,000, but really it's only worth £3.5.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, Kerry, going back to that, the grant was £5,000. Yeah. What's it now?
What's it worth now?
No. Tell me what it is now. It's £5,000 still. And Andrew's right. What's it worth in commercial terms?
Tell me what it's worth.
Yeah.
Can't do much with £5,000, can you?
No, you can't. You can't.
I'll tell you why you can't do anything with £5,000, John. Because British standards, when we're talking about kite marking products, stifle innovation due to the cost.
Yeah, it did.
The cost of kite marking a flood door is something like £50,000. How many flood doors do you have to sell to get your money back?
How about this then? As a solution to that? And I will use the word solution. I've talked to people about this. the government introduce, there's National Test Centre coming, which is fab, introduce a Dragon's Den. So, whether you're an inventor, a big businessman, a grandma or a schoolboy, if you've got a good idea, sell it to the panel, get it tested and get it marketed. Free. How about that?
Never happened, John. Too easy.
I will send your idea to the people who can make those decisions. Unfortunately, it's not me, but I think that's a great idea, particularly in regard to the National Test Centre. If we've got that infrastructure set up already, why aren't we using it to support innovation and progressing things? I just want to move us back to the way we live. I think you used that phrase, John, earlier, and we've had a couple of comments about even in new build properties where there are flood resilience measures in place in terms of the way things have been built, there's a garage space underneath. We're still seeing people convert those garages into habitable rooms, to living rooms, to bedrooms and so on, or lifts in buildings where there is a flood and we find that people can't use the lift for many days, many weeks afterwards. And thinking about, high-rise buildings, we have those. We have elderly, frail people living in high-rise buildings. If they can't use the lift, that's an impossibility for them. I don't really know what I'm asking. How do we solve that? There isn't really a solution to issues like that, is there?
Well, you have it needs, once again, innovation to come up with something. The designers need to have a challenge. Instead of it being, what loads can you take up to floor 19? Right, this lift is going to be submerged in water for a day or two. So design something that's resilient. Simple. But why don't we do that? Somebody might be doing that for all I know. We don't know everything that's going on in this world.
Would you get in a lift, John, if it was flooded?
No.
What's the point then?
Well, I can still walk just about. But if you can't get a wheelchair upstairs, can you? So
no, absolutely not. You can't. But this is what also goes on about when we're looking at PFR, about what we're selling to which people, vulnerable people.
Yeah.
That's a massive issue. What products are being sold? Are you going to sell like a barrier to a 70-year-old woman that's got a 5-year guarantee on it that in 5 years will she be able to use it? What assessments are we doing?
Well, the reality is I've responded to flood events many times when I was in the public sector, and on one occasion we had an emergency call. This is on a Sunday, responding elsewhere, that a resident was trapped in a property. So we got the fire brigade out, the flood teams, and they attended the property. And there was a lady, and she'd been watching TV, watching the football, and she was sat in an armchair, and the water was here. And she was disabled, and she couldn't get out and any longer, and she wouldn't have been able to breathe. And we've got to be catering. When you've got things that we're doing, you've got to cater for the lowest common denominator, not the average.
Every eventuality, John. That's what we've got to cater for.
And like we talk about, Andrew, you and I and Sarah were talking about pumps. Pumps are great as long as you've got power. Same with the lift. So what happens when the power goes?
It sounds like we've also got a social problem here as well. This isn't just a buildings, the construction sector type challenge. This is a social challenge as well when we're thinking about where people are housed, the sort of accommodation they're provided with. We don't have enough housing for social housing tenants, so people are lucky to get a council house. So they go wherever they're sent. Whereas it sounds like what you're saying is we should be thinking a bit more about who goes where, as well as the function of our buildings.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is when you go to these properties, and we're focusing now on domestics, but lets. I've been to loads in my time, I'm sure you have, but you go to a property, you meet a young couple, and they've just got together and they've bought a house and they're doing this. You do some resilience work for them, and you base it, we're always told to base it on the capabilities and capacities of the homeowner. So you go back in 40 years' time, can those people still deal with the measures that we gave them 40 years ago? So rather than thinking, oh, are they physically up to it? Because young people can have disabilities, accidents or whatever. So once again, you go for the lowest common denominator. What's the easiest thing to do? And just base it on that. Because none of us are qualified in occupational health. No. We're not. I'm a chartered engineer, but we didn't cover that.
Do you know, John?
Again, I would say in that flood risk assessment, we should also include, the risk to life. So can we so any assessment is not just talking about the physical things or the environmental things or anything like that. It's also protecting the homeowner and the risk.
Yeah.
So that should be
in terms of the sociological health aspects as well of living in a flooded area, flood groups need a special mention because they are the experts by experience. They're the ones who know who lives where, what help is needed to what people, on what street are the weakest, what's going to happen on the night, on the evening. They stand there in the pouring down rain, guiding the traffic, trying to get people out, messaging everybody all over Facebook. It's unbelievable what they do, and they're underfunded. They're undertrained, underfunded, under-recognised.
And also, when it's not flooding, what are they doing? They're doing a patrol check for blocked gullies, and blocked waterways. It's what they do.
Yeah,
it really is.
And that is a fantastic place for us to end on the thanks to those groups who are out there doing this for us. Before we do close, I just want to summarise what I think are the main takeaways from today's session. So I've written down three key takeaways. The panel has recommended that there needs to be revision to building regulations, to codes of practices, to the flood risk assessment, and to a number of other documents, so that we can move forward in this space, and that there's a need for some sort of regulation around PFR, whether that's government or self-regulation. We need to be making sure that the installations going in are right, they're for the right purpose, they fund the right outcomes, and that there needs to be some sort of widened awareness of flood impacts. It's not just us sat around here who are really invested, the 100 people or so online today. Homeowners, building owners, landlords, estate agents all need to be aware of the risk of flood and how to deal with it, and some sort of regulation or documents produced which are mandatory, so that everybody comes on this journey and we can improve everybody's living conditions. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us today, and particularly to our three panel members, Kerry, John and Andrew. A huge thank you for being with us. If your colleagues have missed today's webinar, it will be online within the next couple of days, and please look out for the link as we send that round to all of you attendees. Finally, before you sign off, please do make sure you complete the survey at the end of this webinar. It will help us to continue to deliver the sort of content that you would like to see. For those of you who'd like to join us next month, please mark Thursday the 27th of March in your diary, when the topic will be waste regulations. Thank you so much for attending this morning, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.